to begin with, I was not even allowed out of the ward, and I had all this energy buzzing around, and what I really needed was to be out walking in nature, but I was incarcerated. And also, it's an incredibly powerless situation to try to explain to people what's happening to you, and then you're realising that everything you're being said, that you're saying, is seen as a sign of psychosis. It's seen as being pathology. Your reality is not on the radar. So I learnt basically to shut up and just behave, because obviously in hospital there's all these rules, and just not cause any trouble. And I was about to say everything settled down, but it didn't really. I was experiencing panic attacks and severe anxiety. So after 6 weeks, I was discharged. The next few weeks were very difficult as well, because it affected me physically. I literally could not walk. I'm normally very sporty, I run a lot, but I found it very hard to walk more than a few hundred metres. And I had the consultant and the other medics coming around, pestering me really, and actually threatening to take me back into hospital if I didn't attend daily day centre, which was really a soul-sapping experience. But eventually, what helped was that, firstly, I had a couple of friends who did understand the experience, so I could talk to them about it, and that was important. And also, I was able to force myself to get out the flat every day and walk into this Oxford city centre, which is normally about a 35-minute walk, but it took me an hour or so because I could hardly walk properly. I had been affected very much physically as well. Gradually, I started to return to some kind of normality, where I was able to sleep more, because I didn't mention before, but not being able to sleep was a big issue. But I was able to sleep better, and I was gradually, I was able to return to be able to function fairly normally. So this experience happened in the February. By the beginning of June, I was able to get back more to normal life. I had friends visiting from France. I was able to show them around Oxford, and we had really quite a good time. I was also able to persuade the psychiatrist to start reducing the medication, and life gradually returned to normal. By the end of the summer, so 6 months in, so I was able to then to look for work again, because I had to give up my work through this experience. But I was able to look for work again, and by the November I actually got some employment, not my normal work, but it was fine. So gradually things returned to normal. I was able to do my normal things. I was able to play music again. I love playing music. But what really helped, so from a crisis, things were coming back to sort of normality. But what really helped was the following year, so May 2017, so this is just over a year after the initial experience, a friend of mine told me about this event called Emerging Proud, where people that had gone through spiritual crisis were starting sort of a movement to create support for people going through spiritual crisis, and to campaign to try to educate, especially the mental health professionals, that there is such a thing called spiritual crisis, and people need a different kind of support through spiritual crisis than they might in traditional mental health services. And I went to this event. It was a very inspiring event. There were nearly 200 people there, and there was an internet connection with another 10 or so countries who were having parallel events with Emerging Proud. And that's when I realised I really wasn't alone. There are a whole number of people that do have spiritual crisis awakening. Quite a number may be Kundalini Awakening, like myself, but there's other kinds of spiritual crisis that people go through. And it was then really when I met other people, and there were some quite inspiring discussions and workshops that went on, and I then realised actually what happened to me was not all negative, because I had viewed it as being very negative, and I had a lot of fear. But I realised actually there really could be something positive about this. And later on that summer, I just woke up one morning and I realised actually I do feel different, but in a positive way. And then I recognised what it was that I mentioned before. When I was a child, my mum was severely ill. In fact, when my youngest brother was born, she had severe postnatal depression, which turned into really quite severe, they used to call it manic depression, but bipolar disorder. And it wasn't her fault. And intellectually, I had totally forgiven her. There was nothing really to forgive. And I thought that I had processed the whole issue. But what I recognised when I woke up that morning was that previously I had held on to emotional hurt. I hadn't let it all go. But I realised, but now I have let it all go. And so what I recognised was that the Kundalini Awakening experience wasn't just a negative, traumatic experience, but actually what it had done, it had sort of like almost on a psychological and spiritual level, almost like cleared me out. It's like something being flushed through. And this emotional hurt, which had clearly affected how I'd formed relationships, especially sexual relationships, it held me back in a way. But that hurt had gone. So it was then I really started to realise that the Kundalini Awakening wasn't just a frightening negative thing, but actually had in many ways been fundamentally positive. It's also around then, after talking to people at the event, then back in the May 2017, they told me about Stefan Grof and literature on spiritual crisis. So I began to actually read books. One book led to another, and I read this, I thought, brilliant book by Catherine G. Lucas called In Case of Spiritual Emergency, which I thought beautifully outlined the experience I had and how she dealt with her experience. This was broader than Kundalini, but the way it describes spiritual crisis and what helps and what hinders was really powerful. And also, around this time, I had kept in touch with the people from Emerging Proud, and the Emerging Proud people had got some funding for a new project called Emerging Kind, and I sort of kept in the loop. And then some months later, I decided to be involved in the project. And what it is that people who have been through spiritual crisis, say maybe Kundalini or another kind of spiritual crisis, were being trained to become peer groups facilitators. So basically trained to set up groups where other people who are going through the experience or have gone through the experience can meet up and provide peer support. And also within this was a strong element of working with mental health professionals and others to try to create a conversation where spiritual crisis could be recognised and people could be listened to rather than being pathologised. And as I became more involved in actually looking at how to support others, I then also began to recognise the positive nature of the experience, and that actually part of the experience leads on to this desire to help others which feels a very positive thing. And then gradually, after talking, especially after talking to others, I began to recognise another level to the experience. So this is now 2 years on from the original experience. And I woke up one morning and I had this really strong sense that my sense of I was residing not from the small self, the constructed self, the little me, but more from a universal self. And out of almost like the corner of my eye, I could see me. I could see Alan Foulkes. No, I was quite sympathetic towards him, but it wasn't really me. It was like the clothes I'm wearing, the clothes I'm wearing in my life. And I've been aware from a intellectual and spiritual perspective that there are these two different selves: the constructed self, the self without any inherent existence, and the sense of the spiritual self, which is a universal self. I had some intellectual sort of understanding of that, but what I felt that morning was not. It was experiential. I was feeling that sense of difference between the self with the big S and the self with the small s. And what I'm finding now is, I wouldn't say I'm particularly awakened, but I'm not totally asleep either. And I can recognise when my ego is getting activated about something. I'm much more able to stand back and observe it, rather than being taken up by it all. And this feels very positive, both from a psychological advancement and a spiritual one. So now, 2.5 years on from the original experience, what seemed like a curse, felt very traumatic, now actually feels like a gift. And I feel that past hurt has been washed away. I feel that I'm able to observe myself rather than get so caught up in everyday emotions and ego. And I don't feel the whole process is finished. I can still sense the energy in my body, especially if I meditate, which I do sometimes, but not as often as I'd like to, so that's something to work on. But I can feel the energy in my hands. The energy in the hands is very, very strong. So I can still, I can feel the difference from before. I didn't have that before. And so what I want to do now is really to let things develop, not to intellectualise things too much, but let it all develop. I'm also really aware of the importance of love, that the essence is love. So if you're helping other people, if you're loving towards other people, that's really an essential part of the spiritual path. It's not just all about fine-tuning yourself so you're some kind of spiritual master. So, yeah, to summarise, it's gone from a negative to a very positive experience, and I'm at the stage now where I just want to really explore how I can make best use of what I've experienced, both for myself and for others, really. So it's a journey. I've gone through some choppy seas, and there may well be more choppy seas further ahead, who knows? But for anyone going through the initial Kundalini Awakening experience who finds it difficult, and I'm sure there are people that it's a smooth process for, but I think for quite a number of people it's a difficult process. But for anyone going through that process, I suppose I would like to say there really is light at the end of the tunnel, and that what appears really, really difficult in the long term, for me, definitely it's a gift. So, and I think that's one of the main ideas behind doing this kind of video, is in that I think the message to get across to people is it's not a common experience, but it's not so uncommon either. And it feels like a positive evolutionary sort of experience, which we can everyone can go through. But it's not necessarily an easy experience.